Have you ever laughed at someone before knowing they held your future in their hands? They didn't see her. They didn't respect her. They dragged her across marble floors like she was nothing. But the price of cruelty is always paid. And sometimes, the debt comes due faster than you can run. Watch carefully. Every second after this is a second closer to their collapse. The revolving doors of the Monarch Hotel spun slowly under the weight of the golden afternoon sun, and when Emma Brooks stepped inside, the atmosphere seemed to shift, not with welcome, but with a subtle, sharp recoil. She wore a plain gray coat too thin for the late New York chill, sneakers scuffed from too many miles walked, and a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder, the strap frayed at the edges. Her hair was pinned back without ceremony, her face bare of makeup, her steps quiet, almost apologetic, across the gleaming marble floor, in a lobby dripping with crystal chandeliers and the polished arrogance of old money. She was a ripple in a mirror that no one wanted to see crack. The concierge glanced up, then down again without a word. A cluster of guests in designer coats looked over their shoulders and smirked, exchanging comments that didn't bother to stay hushed. "Lost," one man muttered, his voice dripping with amusement. A woman clutching a Louis Vuitton bag laughed under her breath. She must be looking for the service entrance. Emma paused for a moment, adjusting her grip on the tote, feeling the heat of their gazes trying to burn holes through her skin. She said nothing. She moved to a small velvet couch near the grand piano, sitting down quietly, her posture straight, her eyes focused forward, refusing to shrink. Behind the front desk, the manager on duty, a man named Marcus Sloan, watched with a sneer that barely touched the corners of his mouth. He leaned toward one of the clerks and whispered something that made the younger man stifle a laugh. Neither of them made a move to approach her. No water was offered. No greetings were extended. It was as if Emma, wrapped in simplicity rather than silk, did not exist. And so, the lobby returned to its low, murmuring rhythm. The clink of cocktail glasses, the muted tapping of Louboutin heels across marble, the low rustle of expensive coats brushed carelessly across gold-trimmed armchairs. All while, the woman they deemed unworthy sat there, unmoving, unbothered on the surface, while beneath her calm exterior, a storm quietly gathered. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know why she had come, but soon they would. And when the truth arrived, it would be far louder than any whisper, far heavier than any of their hollow judgments. It would tear through this gilded place like a reckoning no velvet rope could hold back. Minutes crawled by like hours as Emma sat quietly, her presence an unwelcome bruise against the flawless luxury that surrounded her, and slowly, emboldened by her silence, the mockery began to grow louder, more careless, as if the walls of the Monarch gave permission for cruelty when no one important was watching. A sharply dressed woman at the bar tilted her glass toward Emma, laughing under her breath to her companion. Maybe she thinks there's a soup kitchen here. And a young man lounging on one of the tufted leather sofas lifted his phone, angling it deliberately to capture her sitting alone, already composing a caption, no doubt dripping with contempt. The desk staff continued to ignore her, serving guest after guest who had arrived after her, their smiles widening whenever Emma dared to glance toward the counter. The message clear: you are invisible here, or worse, you are unwanted. Marcus Sloan, the manager, finally strode out from behind the desk, his Italian loafers clicking loudly, a sneer painted across his face as he approached Emma with the careful disdain one reserves for something sticky found on the bottom of a shoe. "Miss," he said, his voice oily, the words stretched with forced patience. "This seating is reserved for guests of the Monarch." He didn't ask if she was a guest. He didn't check her name. He simply decided she didn't belong. Around them, the whispers buzzed louder, excitement growing like a crowd gathering for a public spectacle. Emma looked up at him, her expression unreadable, and softly said, "I'm waiting for someone." Marcus's eyes flickered with disgust, barely concealed behind professional detachment. "I'm afraid you'll have to wait outside," he said, louder this time, making sure the surrounding spectators heard, making sure they knew he was doing his part to preserve the sanctity of the space. Emma remained still, her calm, a quiet rebellion against the mounting humiliation. But Marcus wasn't interested in dignity. He was interested in display, in dominance, in ensuring that this woman, who dared to sit among his pristine clientele, was made an example of. He gestured sharply to two security guards standing near the entrance, and the buzz in the lobby grew electric. Phones lifting, cameras already rolling, ready to capture the moment when the intruder would be removed like trash. Emma's heart pounded against her ribs, but her face remained a mask, serene and steady, even as the guards began moving toward her, even as the grand chandeliers overhead gleamed coldly like watching eyes. She knew this moment, this cruelty, this shallow ritual of false superiority, and still she sat there, refusing to flee, refusing to shrink, knowing that in just a little while, the game they thought they were winning would be ripped from their manicured hands, and the world they believed was theirs alone would crumble at their feet. The security guards reached her, towering figures in dark suits whose expressions mirrored the cold disdain etched across every polished surface of the monarch, and without asking questions, without offering dignity, they each gripped one of Emma's arms and hauled her up from the velvet couch as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience to be cleared away, her tote slipping from her shoulder, spilling a few worn books across the marble floor with soft, humiliating thuds. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, not in protest, but in gleeful anticipation, phones lifting higher to capture her disgrace, some guests chuckling under their breath, others murmuring. About time they cleaned up the place. Marcus Sloane stood with his arms crossed, a victorious smirk curving his lips, watching like a self-appointed king overseeing the expulsion of an unwanted beggar from his kingdom. Emma didn't fight. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She allowed them to drag her across the gleaming lobby floor, her sneakers squeaking softly, her head held high, her face an unreadable mask that infuriated the crowd even more because they wanted her broken, sobbing, defeated. But she would give them none of it. As they reached the heavy brass doors, Marcus followed closely, ensuring every guest had a full view of the spectacle, ensuring there was no misunderstanding about who belonged and who didn't. "Let this be a reminder," he said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear, "that the monarch serves a certain class of clientele. Standards must be maintained." The guards shoved open the massive glass doors and pushed Emma out onto the sun-bleached sidewalk, the hot New York air smacking her in the face, the world of cabs and honking horns and hurrying pedestrians swallowing her without ceremony. Her books were scattered around her feet, unnoticed by the city that never stops moving. Behind the gilded glass, she could see faces pressed against the windows, watching her, laughing, pointing, some even clapping in grotesque celebration. Emma knelt slowly, gathering her belongings with deliberate, graceful movements, her heart hammering inside her chest, but her hands steady, every motion a refusal to let them see how deeply they had tried to wound her. She straightened up, brushed the dust from her coat, lifted her chin against the weight of 1,000 judgments, and turned her back on the Monarch Hotel. They thought they had thrown her out like trash. They thought they had protected their precious image. They thought the story ended here, but they had made one catastrophic mistake. They had humiliated the one person they could never afford to cross. And as a shadow lengthened across the curb, as the sleek black hood of a Rolls-Royce Ghost pulled to a silent stop in front of the hotel, the first crack appeared in their perfect little world. A crack that would soon split the marble beneath their feet wide open. The Rolls-Royce Ghost idled like a beast crouched in the sun, its polished black surface reflecting the stunned faces of passers-by who slowed their steps, sensing something about to rupture the polished facade of the Monarch Hotel, and then, before anyone could process it, the rear door swung open with silent authority, and out stepped Lucas Brooks, a man whose name alone made CEOs sit straighter and senators lower their eyes. He wore a dark tailored suit that whispered money and power, but it was not the clothes that commanded the air around him. It was the force of his presence, sharp and magnetic, as if the very molecules parted for him to pass. His face, usually calm and composed in the glossy pages of financial magazines, was thunderous now, carved with fury, every line of his jaw screaming a warning. He moved past the stunned doorman, who scrambled to bow but received nothing in return. His eyes locked not on the grand entrance, but on the woman standing alone on the sidewalk, her tote clutched against her chest, her hair whipped by the hot New York wind, her dignity burning brighter than any crystal chandelier inside that cursed lobby. Lucas's stride never faltered, not even when Marcus Sloan, still basking in his hollow victory, stepped forward with a practiced smile that faltered the instant he recognized the man bearing down on him. "Mr. Brooks," Marcus stammered, his voice high and panicked. "We weren't expecting—" But Lucas didn't even glance at him. He walked straight to Emma, reached for her hand, and pulled her gently but firmly into his arms, pressing a kiss against her forehead with a reverence that made the onlookers behind the glass suck in collective gasps. Around them, the city noise dimmed to a distant roar. It was only the two of them now, standing together against a world that had dared to forget who she was. Lucas turned, finally, his arm around Emma's shoulders, facing the monarch's staff, who were now frozen in horror, their faces draining of color as realization began its slow, brutal crawl across their minds. His voice, when it came, was low and lethal, a blade sheathed in velvet. "Is this how you treat guests at my hotel?" The words were calm, almost soft, but they carried the weight of hurricanes, of collapsing empires, and Marcus stumbled back, his mouth working soundlessly as if he could summon an excuse that would hold up against the storm about to descend. Lucas's gaze sliced through him and then past him, into the gilded lobby where the guilty stood half hidden behind columns and counters, trying and failing to make themselves invisible. "Bring everyone who touched my wife," Lucas ordered, his voice snapping like a whip. "Every single one who laughed, who watched, who lifted a hand against her. Bring them here, now." And in that moment, the Monarch Hotel, once a fortress of untouchable luxury, began to crack at its foundation. The reckoning they had summoned with their cruelty was no longer creeping toward them. It had arrived, clothed in a simple gray coat and the furious love of a man who could buy and sell the very ground they stood on, but who chose instead to burn down their illusions with nothing more than the truth. The staff scrambled like panicked birds, their polished shoes slipping against the marble as they rushed to obey, dragging forward the trembling faces who had sneered and mocked only minutes before, forming a pathetic, stuttering line at the hotel's grand entrance, where the golden light now seemed to expose every cruel smirk, every whispered insult, every camera lens raised in ridicule. Marcus Sloan stood at the front, sweat beading on his brow, despite the cool blast of air conditioning pouring from the hotel's open doors, his hands clasped in front of him in a desperate, trembling attempt at professionalism. Emma stood half a step behind Lucas, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable, a mirror to the calm before a devastating storm. Lucas let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until every heartbeat in the crowd pounded like war drums against the high ceilings of the Monarch, and then he spoke, not with a raised voice, not with the fury they might have braced themselves for, but with the cold, cutting certainty of a verdict already decided. "This," Lucas said, motioning to Emma, "is Emma Brooks, my wife, my partner, my equal." His words sliced through the crowd, through the heart of the building itself, through every assumption and prejudice that had poisoned the air from the moment Emma stepped inside. He took a slow step forward, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. "And in case any of you have forgotten," he continued, his voice sharpening to a blade, "the Monarch Hotel is owned by Brooks Holdings. That means this hotel, this marble you walk on, the paychecks you cash, the air you breathe inside these walls, all belong to her just as much as they belong to me." Gasps rippled through the line of staff like a tremor, some shrinking visibly, others going pale, a few reaching out as if grasping for apologies that would never be enough. Phones that had been lifted to record Emma's humiliation were now fumbled out of sight, as if hiding the evidence could erase the crimes already committed. Marcus opened his mouth, his voice a dry rasp. "Sir, if we had known, If she had only... But Lucas cut him off with a single, brutal glance. If she had worn diamonds, Lucas said quietly. If she had stepped out of a limo, if she had walked in trailing money behind her like perfume, only then would you have treated her like a human being. No one answered. They didn't have to. The truth hung there, heavy and shameful, laid bare for all to see. Emma didn't speak either. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than their pleas, her dignity more powerful than their excuses. She stood rooted in the truth they had tried to deny her. That respect owed to a stranger is not something that should ever depend on appearances, on wealth, or on assumption. It is a right, as natural as breathing, and its absence reveals more about those who withhold it than those who are denied. And now, the reckoning was no longer a warning on the horizon. It was here. It was now. And it would be merciless. Lucas Brooks stood tall against the golden light spilling from the monarch's towering windows, his arms still firmly wrapped around Emma's shoulders, his presence making the opulent lobby seem suddenly small, suddenly hollow, as if all the marble and gold leaf in the world couldn't hide the rot he had just uncovered. The staff in front of him shifted nervously, some staring down at their polished shoes, others darting frantic glances toward Marcus Sloane, who stood rigid, every inch of him screaming silent pleas for mercy he would never receive. Lucas's voice dropped lower, quieter, but somehow heavier, pulling the weight of the room down with it. "You were given one job," he said, his words sharp and measured, "to create a sanctuary for every guest who walks through these doors. Not just the ones who look the part, not just the ones who can flash a black card at the front desk." His gaze sliced across them all, leaving no one untouched. "You failed. You failed my wife. You failed yourselves. And you failed the monarch." He turned slightly, addressing the head of security, a grim-faced man named Darren, who had remained silent throughout the spectacle, but whose jaw now tightened in quiet understanding. "Effective immediately," Lucas said, his tone final as a slammed gavel. "Marcus Sloane, terminated. Head concierge, terminated. Front desk supervisors on duty, terminated. All security staff who laid a hand on my wife, terminated." He paused, letting the words crash down like waves against a crumbling wall. Gasps and stifled cries rose from the line, a few staff members bursting into desperate protests, hands outstretched, voices cracking with regret. But Lucas didn't waver, didn't blink, didn't offer a shred of reprieve. The lobby seemed to tilt, the chandeliers above swaying ever so slightly as if the building itself recoiled from the brutality of justice delivered. Marcus's face had gone from red to ashen, the sweat now streaming down his temples as he tried to sputter some final defense. But Lucas simply turned his back on him, dismissing him with the same disdain they had once reserved for Emma. "You are trespassers now," Lucas said, almost casually. "Security will escort you off the property. Your access has already been revoked. Your severance, non-existent." Darren and his team moved forward without hesitation, corralling the disgraced staff, herding them toward the massive glass doors through which they had once so gleefully ejected Emma. The irony was not lost on anyone. As they stumbled out into the street, though some weeping, some raging, some stunned into silence. The guests who had watched from the lobby's corners now found themselves shrinking against the walls, their luxury dripping from their shoulders like guilt. They had laughed. They had filmed. They had whispered. But now, in the burning wreckage of their assumptions, they realized that cruelty is not a currency that buys safety. It only accrues a debt that someday must be paid. Emma watched it all unfold with a quiet, devastating calm, her hand resting lightly against Lucas's chest, feeling the steady thud of his heart beneath her fingers, knowing he wasn't doing this for revenge. He was doing it because the world they wanted to build, the world they had fought for, couldn't exist on foundations rotted by arrogance and contempt. It had to be torn down, brick by brick, until something true could stand in its place. And on that bright New York afternoon, under the judging eyes of a city that rarely weeps for the fallen, the Monarch Hotel, and all it had once represented, Learn that real power isn't about exclusion or privilege. Real power is how fiercely you protect what truly matters. And today, dignity mattered more than marble. Humanity mattered more than heritage. And the woman they had tried to break was now the one writing the future they had lost forever. As the disgraced staff vanished into the thick, restless crowd outside, the lobby of the Monarch grew strangely silent, the weight of what had just occurred settling into every crack of its ornate walls. Yet, even in the wreckage of shattered reputations and exposed cruelty, a few souls stood apart, not cowering in fear, but rooted in quiet decency that had survived the storm. And it was toward them that Lucas Brooks turned next, his sharp gaze softening slightly. Among the lingering employees was a young woman in a modest, slightly wrinkled uniform, her hands clasped nervously in front of her, her eyes wide with uncertainty, her badge reading simply Lily Harper, housekeeping. She had been there from the beginning, unnoticed by most, hovering near the columns, watching the humiliation unfold with growing horror. And when no one else had dared to move, when everyone else had picked up their phones to record or had turned away to sneer, she had been the one to quietly slip a glass of water onto the side table near Emma, offering a shy, apologetic smile before retreating again into the shadows of her insignificance. Lucas approached her slowly now, the weight of every watching eye pressing down like a second sky, and Lily swallowed hard, uncertain whether she was about to be reprimanded or rewarded, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. He stopped in front of her, his towering frame casting a long shadow, but his voice when he spoke was gentle, firm, but free of judgment. "What's your name?" he asked, and when Lily stammered her reply, he nodded once, deeply, as if memorizing it not just as a courtesy, but as a promise. He extended his hand, and she blinked, stunned, before reaching out to grasp it. "You," Lucas said, his voice carrying across the now silent lobby, showed more humanity in a single moment than this entire building did all morning. He turned slightly, addressing the room, his voice rising with a quiet intensity that made the chandeliers seem to shiver. In a world obsessed with titles and appearances, kindness is the rarest currency. It's the one thing you cannot fake, cannot forge, and cannot purchase, no matter how many zeros you have in your bank account. He looked back at Lily, his expression softening. Effective immediately, Lily Harper is promoted to guest relations manager and all her educational expenses. From here forward, will be covered by Brooks Holdings. A stunned gasp rippled through the staff and remaining guests, not one of mockery, but one of awe. And for the first time that day, hope bloomed in the Monarch's hallowed halls. Fragile but real, Lily's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears she couldn't hold back, and Emma stepped forward, enveloping the young woman in a warm, sincere embrace that said more than 1,000 grand speeches ever could. The message was clear, undeniable, seared into the heart of everyone who stood, witnessed true loyalty, true grace, true humanity would not just survive in this new world. It would be elevated, honored, and enshrined in the very bones of the Monarch's rebirth. Emma and Lucas stood together, side by side with Lily, the old regime of polished cruelty crumbling behind them, a new legacy rising not from marble or gold, but from the simple, indestructible strength of kindness offered when no one else was willing to stand. And in that luminous, fragile moment, the Monarch ceased to be a hotel built on exclusion and image. It became a beacon for something infinitely rarer, infinitely more powerful dignity worn proudly, humbly, by those who knew that the heart matters far more than the name on the reservation list. Later that evening, as the golden haze of sunset poured through the towering windows of the Monarch Hotel, casting long, solemn shadows across the marble floors, Lucas and Emma Brooks stood before the remaining staff and a scattering of stunned guests who had dared to linger, the weight of the day pressing down like an invisible tide. Yet the air now felt different, less oppressive, less brittle, as if the building itself were exhaling for the first time in years. And in the center of it all stood Emma, no longer the silent, humiliated woman dragged from her rightful place, but the quiet, commanding soul whose very presence had forced the reckoning this place so desperately needed. She didn't raise her voice, didn't posture or preen like the executives who had once ruled these halls with their shallow charm. Instead, she simply stepped forward, her simple coat still wrapped around her hair pulled back with no diamonds, no glimmering gown, only the raw, unmistakable strength of someone who had faced cruelty and refused to bow. She let the silence stretch, heavy and cleansing, until every eye in the room was locked on her, until even the chandeliers above seemed to lean closer to hear, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, clear, and impossibly full of grace. "You saw me today," she said softly, "and you decided I didn't matter." Her words were not angry, not accusing, merely a statement of fact so heavy that it seemed to buckle the polished air itself. "You looked at my coat, my shoes, my bag, and you decided I was less than you." She let her gaze drift across the room, meeting eyes, one by one, forcing them to see her not as a mistake, not as a symbol, but as a human being. "But dignity," she continued, her voice rising just slightly, trembling not with weakness but with fierce, indomitable belief, "is not something you earn with a black card, or a watch, or a last name engraved in marble." She paused, and in that pause, the entire hotel seemed to hold its breath. Dignity is not something you buy. It's something you give, freely, to everyone, every time. She stepped back, her hand finding Lucas's, their fingers intertwining not as a performance, not as a spectacle, but as a reaffirmation of everything they believed in, everything they had built, and everything they would defend against a world too quick to forget the simple, devastating truth that kindness is not a favor reserved for the powerful. It is the foundation of a world worth living in. The staff stood silent, some with tears welling in their eyes, some with heads bowed in shame, others looking at Emma with a dawning awe that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with courage. Behind her, Lucas nodded once, his eyes fierce and proud, then turned toward Darren, the new head of hotel operations, who stood at respectful attention. "Effective immediately," Lucas said, his voice carrying across the lobby like a promise. "The Monarch Hotel will operate under one rule above all others. Every guest, every soul who walks through these doors is to be treated with respect, dignity, and humanity, without exception, without hesitation, without judgment." He paused, his gaze cold and hard now. "Anyone who cannot abide by that principle has no place here, not now, not ever." Applause did not erupt. There was no roaring cheer, no stage celebration. Instead, there was something far greater, far more lasting. A slow, deep, collective breath as the Monarch staff absorbed the new reality, not one dictated by fear, but by hope, a future built not on appearances, but on character. Emma and Lucas stood together beneath the chandeliers, their silhouettes framed by the golden twilight, and in that moment, they were not merely reclaiming a hotel. They were reclaiming a principle, one so easy to dismiss, so easy to forget in a world obsessed with image and illusion, yet so vital that without it, even the grandest empires will someday crumble into dust. And as the night fell over New York City, the Monarch Hotel, once a monument to shallow luxury, began its slow, powerful rebirth as a place where humanity came first, not because it was profitable, not because it was fashionable, but because it was right. Weeks passed, and the story of the woman who had been dragged out of the Monarch Hotel only to return as its true queen spread like wildfire, not as a fleeting scandal, but as a legend whispered through boardrooms and break rooms, dinner parties and newsrooms, a parable of pride undone and dignity reborn. The video footage of Emma Brooks being embraced by Lucas on the marble steps became iconic, replayed across social media, dissected by morning shows, immortalized in headlines that screamed about a revolution no one had seen coming. But while the world fixated on the drama of downfall and revenge, something deeper, quieter, and infinitely more powerful was taking root beneath the noise. Across the country, Other hotels took notice. Companies once proud of their exclusivity suddenly found themselves under scrutiny, their practices questioned, their glossy facades cracking under the pressure of a public that had remembered. Somehow, that kindness mattered. And amidst it all, the Monarch Hotel led the charge, not with hollow apologies or PR-driven campaigns, but with action. Emma and Lucas worked side by side with the new management, rewriting the Monarch's policies from the ground up, instituting rigorous empathy training, creating scholarships for staff from underprivileged backgrounds, instituting programs that rewarded unseen acts of kindness instead of superficial displays of luxury, and slowly, steadily, the Monarch transformed from a symbol of elitism into a beacon of true hospitality, the kind that could not be faked with gold trim or five-star menus, but could only be built from the daily, stubborn choice to see the humanity in every person who crossed its threshold. Guests returned, not because of spectacle, but because word spread. Here, you were seen, no matter what you wore, no matter where you came from. Here, your worth was not measured by the weight of your wallet, but by the simple, sacred fact that you existed. And as the Monarch flourished, so too did the world beyond its doors. Airline companies revamped their training manuals. Luxury retailers softened their velvet ropes. Conferences and seminars sprang up titled, "The Monarch Standard: Why Dignity is Good Business." And slowly, in small but profound ways, the industry changed. The ripple effect of one act of cruelty met with unimaginable grace, transforming not just a hotel, but an entire culture. Emma Brooks never once took a public victory lap. She refused interviews, declined awards, and ignored the gushing profiles written about her quiet power. Instead, she spent her mornings walking through the Monarch's now warm halls, chatting with the doormen by name, sitting for coffee with the housekeeping team, slipping handwritten thank you notes to staff who thought no one noticed their late-night shifts or their tired smiles. She lived what she preached, every day, and in doing so, she built a legacy no scandal could tarnish and no fortune could overshadow. In the end, the Monarch Hotel didn't just survive the reckoning. It was reborn from it, stronger, truer, more beautiful in its humility than it had ever been in its ostentatious youth. And in the quiet spaces between all the noise, in the everyday moments no camera bothered to record, Emma and Lucas proved something the world had been too quick to forget. That real power lies not in who you can push down, but in who you choose to lift up, and that the true measure of a place, of a life, of a legacy, is not how grand it looks under a chandelier, but how brightly it shines when no one is looking. You thought dignity could be measured by a suit. You thought that worth could be priced by a watch. But when the world they built on pride shattered, it wasn't the loudest who survived. It was the quiet ones, the ones they tried to humiliate, the ones they tried to erase. Remember this, the face you mock today might be the hand that closes the door on you tomorrow. And when that moment comes, there will be no warning, only silence and consequences.